Today we'll talk about how to write a thesis statement for a presentation. I have thought a lot about this topic and I kept putting it off, but I think I've come up with a great video for you to help move your thesis statements to the next level. So let's unpack the details. Welcome back to the channel. If you've never tuned in before, Communication Coach does weekly videos on communication and leadership. Question for this video is, what are your tips for making a thesis more effective? I would love to hear your feedback in that section below the video. First, we'll do an overview of what a thesis statement is to begin with, then we'll give some examples, and I'll finish up with some pro tips to take it to the next level. So in terms of overview, a thesis statement should be one concise sentence in the introduction of your presentation. You have to be really clear about leading with a strong thesis statement in your introduction. It should be specific to your presentation. It shouldn't be a general statement about the topic you're talking about. It should be customized to exactly what you're going to say during the rest of the presentation. A thesis statement answers the question, what is the bottom line of your presentation? So if a friend of yours said, oh, what are you presenting on? You would give them in one sentence the bottom line. That's when you know you're getting at a thesis statement. A thesis statement does not merely introduce or announce your topic. A thesis statement summarizes your point of view that you are offering during this presentation. Some people call it your central idea, your argument. You might say it's your judgment on the particular topic, your informed opinion. It's your position. A thesis statement should also be debatable. Since this is your argument, your point of view, in theory, people should be able to say, well, I don't know if I agree with that. That's not my point of view. So you want to make sure that you have something that is a position that you're going to argue. Even if you're doing a regular old informative presentation, when you're just teaching somebody how to do something, you should have a point of view on that to make sure you drive it home during the presentation. So let's talk about some examples. Let's say you're going to talk about financial planning for college students. That's your topic. Well, a lot of people might just stop there and think that if I just announce my topic, that's the same as a thesis statement. But it's not quite there yet. In fact, it's not even really a statement. It's just a description of what you're going to talk about. A thesis would sound like this. The best time to invest for retirement is in your first job after college. That is arguable. That's your point of view. And it's going to take a little convincing, even if you're doing just a regular old informative presentation about investing for college students. By offering a point of view, you're going to be much more convincing and your listeners are much more likely to put your suggestions into practice. Let's take another example. Let's say we're going to talk about health and fitness. Now, if I only said, today I'm going to talk about health and fitness, that's not really a thesis statement yet. I've simply announced the topic. A thesis would sound like this. The most effective way to lose weight is by eating less, not exercising more. So what I've done there is I've narrowed down to my particular viewpoint that I am going to explain in detail in the rest of this presentation. That's how you know you have a thesis statement. So let's add some details to this. A lot of people ask, should I say, I argue before I state my thesis? I don't think you have to use that phrase, but I do 100% support making your thesis statement stand out in some way. And so you could use that phrase to help it stand out. You could say, I argue that the most effective way to lose weight is by eating less, not exercising more. If you said that phrase, even though it might sound a little overused, it definitely will help your listeners know that that's your argument. So anything that helps them know what your argument is, then I think it's a great idea. There are certainly other more natural ways to phrase it, and you can look for your own ways. Here are some suggestions. You can say any of these phrases right before you would state your actual thesis. My point is this. What I hope you take away today is, I am convinced that, I would like you to consider this point, or the bottom line is, and again, after each of those phrases, you would simply pick one and then state your thesis. But I encourage you to come up with your own wording. But whatever it is, it should help your thesis statement stand out a little bit more. I'd like to give you 4 pro tips now to take your thesis statements to the next level. The first one is to non-verbally emphasize your thesis. So let's say you've crafted your words. You can use nonverbal communication to add emphasis. You might add pauses, for example, right before and right after your thesis statement to help it pop out a little more. The bottom line is this, pause. The best time to invest for retirement is when you get your first job after college. Pause. So you pause right before and after, and that one sentence will stand out just a little bit more. You can also emphasize your keywords in your thesis statement a little more by just hitting them harder. You can say the bottom line is this: the best time to invest for retirement is when you get your first job after college. And by slowing down and emphasizing the keywords a little more, it'll help your argument stand out as well. Another pro tip is you should thread your thesis through your whole presentation. You shouldn't just mention it in the introduction. You want to make sure once you have your argument that you reiterate it over and over again. You should at least do it in your introduction, in the first, second, and third main point, whatever those main points are in your presentation, and then mention it one last time in the conclusion. And you can certainly vary your wording a little bit for style, but you want to make sure you emphasize that argument as often as possible without being repetitive. Another pro tip is to create a theme around your thesis. So let's say you want to do that by using an analogy or a metaphor to further emphasize your thesis. For example, if I'm talking about long-term investing, I might use the metaphor of farming to make that idea stick just a little bit more. So farmers plant seeds early in the season, and then over time, that food grows in the ground until it sprouts up, and then in the end, you have a large harvest. That's a great metaphor for investing. You can also create a visual theme by using visual aids, for example, to emphasize it. Maybe you can find some appropriate pictures that somehow associate farming with growth and money, and then you could use those as your slide backgrounds or integrate those pictures in some way. Any kind of visual aids like that would help. The fourth pro tip is to use artful language. Once you have a good thesis statement, you can actually craft it just a little bit more using certain strategies to make it more memorable. For example, you might use alliteration, where a number of the words start with the same first letter. That'll make it more memorable. You might say, for example, sow the seeds for your retirement savings in the first season of your career. Now, that might be a little much for some people, and I personally like alliteration because I think it's much more subtle than you realize. There are a lot of S's there, but if I hadn't been emphasizing them and telling you that we were doing it, you might just hear this as a nice sounding, memorable sentence. Another way to use artful language is to rhyme. Now, I've never been a rhymer. I don't think I've ever rhymed in any of my presentations, but I have seen many people do it effectively. For example, you might say, exercise is great, but it's the food on your plate that changes your weight. Now, that's a lot of rhyming, and again, I couldn't pull it off. And if you like rhyming, but you don't want to do too much of it, maybe you could change one of those words, like exercise is wonderful instead of exercise is great. And that would downplay it just a little bit, but then you still get the food on your plate that changes your weight, which is memorable, and it helps it stick. So these 4 pro tips, if you add them to what you're already doing in your thesis statement, will certainly give you a strong thesis. So to recap, we did a little overview about what a thesis statement is in the first place. We gave some concrete examples, and then we gave some pro tips to take them to the next level. And as I mentioned, question of the day: what are your tips for making a thesis statement more effective? I would love to hear your comments in that section below the video. Hope you got something out of this video on how to do a thesis statement for a presentation. If you have not yet subscribed to this channel, Communication Coach, I invite you to do so. So thanks. God bless, and I will see you in the next video.